He didn't just photograph scandals, he survived them. Maison Valerius had survived wars, recessions, revolutions in taste. It had not been built to survive indifference. Claire Valerius understood this with a clarity that bordered on cruelty as she stood at the head of the boardroom table, the city of Paris unfolding behind the glass like an accusation. The room smelled faintly of polished wood and old money, a scent that once signified permanence. Now it felt like stagnation trapped in luxury. The screen behind her displayed numbers that refused sentimentality. Revenue decline was no longer a trend. It was a trajectory. Her father's portrait hung on the far wall, painted during the brand's golden era. He looked confident, almost amused, as if the future had been something he could negotiate personally. Claire had grown up believing the same thing. She no longer did. The board members listened in professional silence as the financial director finished his report. No interruptions. No protests. Everyone in the room already knew the conclusion. They were simply avoiding being the first to acknowledge it. When the presentation ended, no one asked questions. They avoided her eyes. Respect remained, but belief was evaporating. If nothing changes within the fiscal year, the director finally said, voice neutral, Maison Valerius will require external intervention. It was a careful phrase. Everyone understood its translation. Acquisition, loss of control, erosion of identity until the brand name became a decorative shell for something else. Claire nodded once and dismissed the meeting. She waited until the room emptied before allowing herself to sit down. The chair felt wrong. Too heavy. Too symbolic. She placed her hands on the table and felt the faint scratches beneath the polish. Marks left by decades of negotiations, victories, and compromises. Her father had thrived in this space. She was being slowly crushed by it. She walked the archive corridor alone. Campaigns from the past stared back at her. Models defiant, silhouettes daring, compositions that once caused outrage and admiration in equal measure. These images had changed fashion because they had not asked permission. The recent campaigns, she knew, were flawless and invisible. Safe, correct, forgettable. That night, long after the building emptied, Claire sat in her office scrolling through proposals from creative agencies. Each promised modernization, respect for heritage, and risk-aware innovation. The language was identical, interchangeable. None of them made her uncomfortable. That realization terrified her more than the numbers. She closed the folder without saving it, opened a new browser tab, typed a name she had avoided for months because saying it out loud felt like a gamble she wasn't ready to take. Elias Rook. The results were immediate and overwhelming. Headlines framed him as a problem. Galleries framed him as a visionary. Brands that once hired him now pretended he never existed. His images were confrontational, intimate, unfiltered to the point of violence. Not violent in subject, but in truth. They stripped away performance and exposed something raw underneath. This is what scares them, Claire thought. Hiring him would not reassure investors. It would antagonize them. It would provoke questions about ethics, control, and leadership. It would invite scrutiny at the worst possible moment, which meant it was the first honest idea she'd had since her father's death. She wrote the email herself, deliberately brief, stripped of corporate tone. She did not mention contracts or protections. She spoke only of failure and necessity. When she sent it, she expected silence, rejection, mockery. 13 minutes later, her phone vibrated. Elias's reply was blunt, unsentimental, almost dismissive. But it wasn't a no. The studio he sent the address to existed outside the polished world Claire inhabited. Concrete floors, wires exposed, light manipulated rather than softened. Nothing about the space asked for approval. When she arrived, Elias didn't greet her. He adjusted equipment, moved with the calm confidence of someone entirely uninterested in hierarchy. "You're late," he said without looking at her. "I'm early," she replied. "You changed the time." That earned his attention. When he turned, his gaze was assessing, not predatory. He wasn't impressed by her name or intimidated by her authority. That, she realized, was the point. "You want to save a corpse," he said. "I want to revive something people stopped feeling," Claire answered. He smiled faintly, not unkindly. "Those are not the same thing." She didn't argue. She stepped closer, standing amid unfinished work and rejected perfection. Maison Valerius is dying because it stopped taking risks before it stopped making money. I won't repeat that mistake. Elias studied her, searching for hesitation. Finding none. If I do this, he said slowly, I don't obey your comfort zones. I don't protect your mythology. And I don't pretend the past was clean. Claire inhaled. She thought of the board. The creditors. The vultures circling unseen. Then she nodded. Good, she said. My father built an empire by breaking rules. I won't lose it by worshipping them. Elias extended his hand. Not agreement. A test. The moment she took it, Claire understood that she had crossed a line that could not be uncrossed. She had invited instability, controversy, and brilliance into a house that had been suffocating under its own caution. The empire did not collapse that day, but it stopped pretending it was invincible. The first confrontation was inevitable. Claire knew it the moment Elias Rook walked into Maison Valerius without an assistant, without a schedule, without even pretending to respect the choreography of power that governed the building. He arrived late on purpose, she suspected, wearing black that looked lived in rather than styled, carrying nothing but a small hard drive in his pocket. The creative department had been assembled like a firing squad. Art directors, brand strategists, legal observers. Too many people, all waiting to measure him against expectations he had never agreed to meet. Claire watched from the end of the table as Elias took in the room with a single slow glance, already cataloging weaknesses. You won't like what I'm about to say, he began, without greeting anyone. And if you do, it means I've failed. A murmur rippled through the room. Claire didn't interrupt. She had hired him for this exact discomfort. Elias connected the hard drive to the main screen. The first image appeared instantly. It wasn't clothing forward. It wasn't aspirational. It was intimate to the point of intrusion. A model staring directly into the lens, expression unreadable, body half-dressed, posture unapologetic. The Valerius silhouette was there, but stripped of glamour, reduced to structure and intent. This, Elias said, is what your brand used to do. It confronted people. Now it sedates them. One of the senior art directors cleared his throat. Our clients expect refinement. They expect safety, Elias corrected. Refinement is risk executed well. Safety is fear wearing good tailoring. Claire felt the room tense around her. She saw the legal counsel already making notes, the marketing lead mentally drafting excuses. Every instinct trained into her since childhood told her to mediate, to soften the blow. She ignored it. Go on, she said. Elias clicked forward. The next images grew more confrontational. Models in vulnerable poses. Lighting that emphasized imperfections. Fabric treated as armor rather than decoration. It was unmistakably Valerius, and completely unlike anything the house had produced in years. This campaign doesn't sell fantasy, Elias continued. It sells authority. It reminds people why your name mattered before algorithms decided taste. Silence followed. Not confusion. Recognition. That was what frightened them. After the meeting dissolved into controlled chaos, Claire found Elias alone in the fitting hall, surrounded by mannequins in various stages of undress. You just declared war on my entire executive team, she said. I declared honesty, he replied. They're the ones who'll decide if it becomes war. She studied him closely now, without the distance of titles. You know they'll resist you. They already are. His mouth curved slightly. Including you. Claire didn't deny it. I'm risking everything by letting you do this. No, Elias said calmly. You're risking everything by not. That night, Claire received the first call she'd been dreading. Julian Vine introduced himself smoothly, voice polished, tone friendly. He congratulated her on bold creative hires and casually mentioned that he had recently acquired a portion of Maison Valerius's outstanding debt. Not enough to control it, he assured her. Just enough to care deeply about its future. The next morning, Julian Vine's name appeared on the agenda as an incoming board member. The timing was surgical. Claire felt the trap closing, slowly and politely. She met Elias in her office later that day. We have a problem, she said. He looked at her with interest rather than concern. Good, he replied. That means we're doing something worth stopping. Claire turned toward the window, Paris sharp and indifferent below. She understood now that the choice she'd made wasn't just creative. It was political, personal, dangerous. And for the first time since inheriting the empire, she didn't retreat from the danger. Julian Vine did not arrive like a threat. That was his greatest advantage. He entered Maison Valerius the way parasites always did, quietly, legally, with impeccable manners and paperwork that made resistance look irrational. By the time Claire sat across from him in the boardroom, he was already embedded. His seat had been added between meetings, his name printed cleanly on agendas that pretended he had always belonged there. He was younger than she expected. Early 40s, maybe less. No ostentatious wealth, no aggressive presence. His suit was conservative, his smile calculated to disarm rather than dominate. Men like him never raised their voices. They let numbers do the violence. "I won't waste your time," Julian said, folding his hands neatly. "I admire Maison Valerius. I always have, which is why I stepped in when I saw vulnerability." Claire didn't respond. She had learned early that silence unsettled men who relied on persuasion. "The fashion industry is cruel to sentiment," Julian continued smoothly. "Legacy is a beautiful word, but it doesn't service debt. I'm here to help you avoid unpleasant outcomes. By buying our liabilities," Claire said evenly, "and converting concern into leverage." Julian smiled, approving rather than offended. "You understand the mechanics. That's refreshing." The board watched carefully. No one challenged him. His presence offered comfort to those who feared collapse more than compromise. Claire saw it in their posture. The subtle relief that someone else might take responsibility for hard decisions. Julian leaned back slightly. "I won't insult you by pretending this is philanthropy. I invest in distressed assets with potential. Maison Valerius still has cultural capital. It simply needs recalibration." Claire felt the word land like a blade. Recalibration meant dilution. Control without ownership. A slow erasure disguised as optimization. After the meeting, Julian caught up with her in the corridor. His tone softened, almost intimate. "You're doing impressive work under impossible pressure," he said. "But pressure breaks people before it builds diamonds." "I didn't ask for your concern," Claire replied. "No," he agreed. "You didn't. But you'll need my consent soon enough." She watched him walk away, already certain that he had been studying her long before she knew his name. Elias reacted exactly as she expected when she told him. He didn't rage. He didn't panic. He laughed once, short and humorless. "A predator," he said. "Classic. He owns enough of our debt to influence decisions," Claire replied. "He'll push for a sale the moment the numbers allow it." "Which means we don't give him time," Elias said. "We move faster." "Louder." "That's not how boards work," she said. "That's how pressure works," he countered. "You hired me to create impact. This is what impact attracts." Their conversations shifted after that. No longer just creative debates, but strategic ones. They spoke late at night, poring over mock-ups and projections, balancing provocation against survivability. Claire began to see the house through Elias's eyes, not as something to protect, but something to weaponize. Julian, meanwhile, increased his presence. Casual emails, strategic suggestions, private conversations with board members that excluded Claire. Always polite, always reasonable, always circling the same conclusion. Selling was inevitable. He never mentioned Elias directly. That omission was deliberate. Claire understood the warning beneath it. Julian didn't attack what he planned to use later. The campaign accelerated. Shoots ran overnight. Images leaked strategically. Online discourse ignited. Valerius appeared in places it hadn't been invited in years. Debates, essays, arguments. The brand became controversial again. Alive. Stock indicators flickered upward. Not enough to save them yet, but enough to irritate Julian. He requested a private meeting with Claire at the end of the week. "No assistance. No minutes. I want to be clear," he said once the door closed. "You're talented, but talent without backing gets devoured. Let me absorb the risk. You can remain the face of the house." "And Elias?" Claire asked. Julian's eyes flickered, just briefly. Temporary assets are rarely worth long-term loyalty. Claire understood then. Julian wasn't just after the company. He was isolating her, removing variables, preparing to force a decision when she was tired enough to call it pragmatism. When she left the room, Claire felt the weight of it settle fully. This was no longer about saving a brand from irrelevance. It was about defending ownership of vision against someone who believed everything had a price. And she knew, with absolute certainty, that Julian Vine had not yet shown his sharpest teeth. The campaign detonated quietly at first. One image released without commentary, then another 24 hours later, then a short video cut that refused to explain itself. Maison Valerius did not announce a rebirth, it provoked one. The fashion press hesitated, unsure whether to condemn or celebrate. Social platforms did the work for them. Debate replaced indifference. Arguments replaced silence. Within a week, Valerius was no longer invisible. Claire monitored the metrics without allowing her self-satisfaction. Engagement spiked first, then secondary coverage, then buyers who had written the house off years ago began requesting previews under the guise of curiosity. The board, which had braced for backlash, now spoke in cautious optimism. Not praise. Not yet. But the tone had shifted. Fear was no longer the dominant emotion. Elias remained unmoved by the numbers. "This is the easy part," he said during a late-night review session, images scattered across the floor between them. "They're reacting. The question is whether they'll follow." "They already are," Claire replied, pointing to a private message thread from a European retailer who had canceled Valerius 2 seasons earlier. "They just don't want to admit it publicly yet." The first runway preview confirmed it. Attendance exceeded expectations. Not the old guard, but editors and buyers who thrived on being early rather than correct. The collection was sharp, restrained, and confrontational in equal measure. No nostalgia, no apology. The applause was not thunderous, but it was real, sustained. Julian Vine watched from the second row, expression unreadable. He did not clap immediately. When he did, it was slow, deliberate. Claire felt his gaze linger on her longer than necessary. That night, Maison Valerius stock ticked upward for the third consecutive day. Not salvation, but momentum. Enough to disrupt Julian's internal timeline. Enough to make him recalibrate. It was after midnight when Claire finally left the building. Elias was waiting outside, leaning against the stone facade, cigarette unlit between his fingers. "You didn't collapse," he said. "Neither did you," she replied. They stood there longer than professionalism allowed. Neither acknowledged it. The city hummed around them, indifferent to reputations and risk. Their first kiss happened without ceremony, without planning. It was not reckless. It was inevitable, built from weeks of proximity, shared pressure, and mutual recognition. It didn't feel like a mistake. That realization frightened Claire more than the act itself. They were careful after that. Excessively so. No messages that couldn't be justified. No meetings without purpose. On site, Elias remained the volatile creative force. Claire remained the controlled executive. Their roles did not blur in public. In private, everything changed. They met in borrowed spaces, a photographer's apartment, a hotel booked under an assistant's name, the studio long after the staff had gone. Their intimacy was quiet, deliberate, stripped of illusion. It wasn't an escape from reality. It was reinforcement against it. Elias never asked her to choose between him and the house. Claire never pretended the house wasn't part of her. The balance was fragile, but it held. For now, the board noticed the results. Confidence returned, cautious but genuine. Conversations shifted from survival to strategy. Julian noticed that too. He stopped offering suggestions. Stopped warning. That silence was not acceptance. It was calculation. Claire understood the danger even as she allowed herself, briefly, to believe they had bought time. Success had not neutralized the threat. It had sharpened it. As she lay awake beside Elias one night, watching the city lights crawl across the ceiling, Claire felt the familiar weight return. Triumph, she realized, was not the opposite of risk. It was standing on the edge and knowing someone would eventually try to push you. Julian Vine did not strike immediately. He waited for momentum to turn into confidence, for headlines to soften from skepticism into praise. He waited until Maison Valerius began to believe, just a little, that it had survived the worst of it. Only then did he move. The first warning came disguised as curiosity. An article surfaced online from a niche cultural outlet, framed as a retrospective on provocative fashion photography of the early 2010s. Elias's name appeared halfway down the piece, not in the headline, not emphasized, just present. The images were blurred, contextualized, almost academic, almost harmless. Claire saw it within minutes of publication. She understood the technique immediately. This wasn't an attack. It was a probe. Elias reacted differently. He didn't deny recognition. He dismissed it. Old work, he said. Already litigated by public opinion a decade ago. It's not the work, Claire replied. It's the timing. She was right. 2 days later, a second piece appeared, this one sharper in tone. It questioned consent standards from that era, implied power imbalance, asked why certain photographers had been protected by genius narratives. The images were no longer blurred. The framing was no longer neutral. Julian requested a private meeting the same afternoon. He arrived with a slim folder, unbranded, placed it on the table without opening it. "You know what this is," he said pleasantly. Claire didn't reach for it. "You're late," she replied. Julian smiled. "I prefer precision to haste." He leaned back. "The climate has changed. Context is no longer a defense. Perception is." He finally opened the folder. Inside were printed stills from Elias's early work, cropped, reframed, stripped of the original editorial narratives. Beside them were timelines, screenshots, financial traces that mapped the spread of outrage as if it were an investment opportunity. "These images," Julian continued, "will not be debated. They will be judged. And judgment today is immediate." "You're threatening to destroy a man's life to pressure a business decision," Claire said. "I'm offering you a way to protect your brand," Julian corrected calmly. "Publicly sever ties. Condemn the past. Sell your shares at a fair discount." "Fair," she repeated. "For a house in recovery," he said. "Generous, even." Claire closed the folder without touching the contents. "And if I refuse?" Julian's tone didn't change. "Then you become complicit. A progressive leader defending an indefensible man. That narrative writes itself." She felt the trap fully now. This wasn't about Elias's guilt or innocence. It was about optics weaponized into inevitability. Julian wasn't attacking the house directly. He was poisoning the ground it stood on. When she told Elias, the argument they had avoided finally arrived. "I can disappear," he said immediately. "I've done it before." "That's exactly what he wants," Claire replied. "He wants you intact," Elias shot back. "And I won't be the cost." "You already are," she said quietly. The words landed harder than either expected. Silence followed, thick and unresolved. Elias turned away first. "You don't get to use me as proof of courage," he said. "And you don't get to martyr yourself to make my decisions easier," Claire replied. They stood on opposite sides of the room, connected by something neither was willing to weaponize against the other. Outside, the city continued to celebrate Valerius's resurgence, unaware that the past had reached forward with sharpened hands. Claire understood now that Julian wasn't asking for surrender. He was forcing a moral calculation under public threat. Save the house by destroying the man who helped revive it, or defend him and risk becoming collateral. For the first time since this began, Claire didn't know which choice would cost her more. Julian Vine chose the setting carefully. Not the boardroom, not his office. A private dining room in a discreet hotel, particular, neutral territory disguised as civility. The kind of place where deals were framed as conversations and threats wore tailored restraint. Claire recognized the strategy the moment she arrived. This was where outcomes were normalized. Julian was already seated, folder beside his glass, untouched. He stood when she entered, courteous, almost warm. "I appreciate you coming," he said. "I didn't come for pleasantries," Claire replied, taking her seat. "Good," Julian said, sitting. "Neither did I." He opened the folder this time. Not the images themselves, but projections. Headlines. Social media timelines. Mock statements attributed to Maison Valerius that had never been written but were already plausible. The machinery of outrage mapped with investor precision. "This doesn't need escalation," Julian said evenly. "You fire Elias Rook. You issue a statement acknowledging ethical misjudgment. You position yourself as decisive, modern, responsible. And the shares," Claire said. Julian nodded. "You sell your controlling interest. Quietly. At a valuation that reflects risk." "You engineered the risk," Claire replied. "I recognized it," Julian corrected. "That's the difference between manipulation and intelligence." Claire leaned forward. "You're not protecting ethics. You're laundering greed through morality." Julian didn't deny it. Morality is only useful if people believe it's sincere. She understood now. This was not blackmail driven by passion or revenge. It was structural. Julian had turned cancel culture into a financial instrument. The images were currency. Elias was leverage. Claire was the final variable. "If I refuse," she said, voice steady, "you publish everything." "Yes." "And if I comply?" Elias becomes a cautionary footnote. You become a case study in leadership. Maison Valerius survives. At what cost? She didn't ask. She already knew. That night, Claire and Elias met without touching. No pretense of intimacy, no protective gestures. Only the raw weight of the choice between them. He wants me gone publicly, Elias said. Erased and condemned. He wants me obedient, Claire replied. Elias laughed quietly. At least one of us still has a choice. That's not true, she said sharply. You're choosing to disappear so I don't have to decide. And you're choosing to keep a house over a man, he shot back. The words hung between them, ugly and unfair, but real. I didn't ask for this, Elias continued. I didn't ask to be your liability. And I didn't ask to inherit a collapsing empire, Claire replied. But here we are. Silence followed. Not the silence of distance, but of restraint. They were both holding back decisions that would end something irreversibly. Julian's deadline arrived the next morning in the form of a single message. No threats, no embellishment. Just a date, a time, and the words, final medical clearance of reputation. Claire stared at her reflection in the darkened glass of her office window long after midnight. She understood now that there was no version of this where everyone walked away clean. The only question left was whether she would allow someone else to decide what truth looked like. Outside, Paris slept. Inside, the empire waited. The fracture did not happen in a single moment. It widened quietly, through exhaustion, through fear, through words spoken too sharply to be taken back. Claire felt it every time she looked at Elias and saw not a partner, but a variable in someone else's equation. Elias felt it every time he looked at her and wondered whether the house would always come first. They met in the studio late, the place where everything had begun and where nothing felt neutral anymore. The images on the walls watched them like witnesses. You're not listening to me, Elias said, breaking the silence. I'm telling you how this ends. You're predicting the ending that hurts you least, Claire replied. That's not fair. No, she said quietly. But it's accurate. He paced once, stopped. If I disappear, the story collapses. Julian loses leverage. You keep the house. And you become the villain by default, Claire said. You think he'll stop there? You think erasure is mercy? Elias looked away. At least it's my choice. Is it? She asked. Or is it the choice he wants you to make so I don't have to? The words struck deeper than accusation. They exposed the real fear beneath their arguments, that Julian had already succeeded in turning them against each other. You don't understand what this house means, Elias said finally. I understand exactly what it means, Claire replied, voice tightening. It's not a brand to me. It's my father's life. His mistakes. His faith in me. And I'm collateral, Elias said. No, she snapped. You're the reason it still exists. They fell silent again. The distance between them was no longer physical. It was ethical, emotional. Each of them was guarding something the other couldn't afford to lose. Elias spoke first. If you stand with me publicly, you lose everything. And if I abandon you, Claire replied, I become exactly what Julian thinks I am. The truth was brutal in its symmetry. There was no clean sacrifice, only unequal losses. When Elias left that night, he didn't slam the door. He didn't say goodbye. He simply stepped into the darkness of the stairwell, leaving Claire alone with the weight of a choice that could no longer be deferred. She stayed until dawn, reviewing documents she had avoided. Old financial records, early sponsorship structures, peripheral names attached to Elias's past projects. Something Julian had said earlier resurfaced in her mind. Recognition, not manipulation. What if the images weren't merely found? The thought unsettled her enough to keep digging. Not to defend Elias blindly, but to understand the shape of the weapon being used against them. By morning, Claire no longer felt paralyzed. She felt focused. The fault line had split them, but it had also exposed something buried beneath the surface. Claire did not sleep that night. She remembered a locked safe in her father's private study, containing files on aggressive investors he had rejected years ago. Among the old ledgers, she found a redacted report on a young Julian Vine. Her father hadn't just tracked Vine's money, he had tracked his methods. Using the specific offshore account numbers found in those old files as a key, she spent the night cross-referencing them with the production credits of Elias's early shoots. The digital trail, hidden for a decade, finally snapped into place. Julian Vine hadn't just found the incriminating photos. He had been the secret financier behind the very shoots he was now using as a weapon. She knew she couldn't handle this alone. Elias was still distant, wary after their argument, but she sent him a terse message. Meet me at the studio. 10 a.m. No explanation, no pleading. Only a necessity that even he would recognize. He arrived precisely on time, arms crossed, eyes guarded. "You found something," he said before she could speak. "Not something," Claire replied. She laid out the documentation, the timeline, the financial links. Elias leaned over the table, scanning each page carefully, fingers tracing lines of numbers and names. "He financed the shoots himself," Elias said finally, disbelief tinting his tone. "He set me up? Used my work as bait?" Claire nodded. "Exactly. And now he thinks the narrative is irreversible, that by isolating us, he controls the story. Which means we don't let him," Elias said. His voice was sharper now, tension transforming into resolve. "We take control of the story ourselves." They spent the day coordinating strategy in a silence that was cold and clinical. The words from their argument still hung in the air, collateral and empire, making every shared glance feel like a bruise. They didn't talk about their feelings, they talked about survival. Claire drafted statements and preemptive explanations for journalists, while Elias meticulously curated the sequence of images to be revealed. Every word was a shield, every image a weapon. They rehearsed the delivery like soldiers preparing for an ambush, anticipating Julian's every move. Despite the tension between them, their movements were perfectly synchronized, driven by a desperate, shared necessity. Claire felt a grim focus she had never known. She wasn't just defending a brand. She was fighting to prove she could protect the house without sacrificing the man. By midnight, the trap was set. They left the studio separately, the unresolved fracture between them still wide. But their target was finally in their sights. The grand hall of the Hotel de Ville gleamed under crystal chandeliers, a river of polished marble and whispered anticipation. Valerius clients, journalists, and select socialites filled the room, unaware that every eye would soon witness not just fashion, but strategy in motion. Claire moved through them with calm precision, a carefully measured smile in place of the tension she carried all week. Julian Vine, predictably, was already present, seated at the head table, surveying the crowd like a general waiting for battle. Elias was at her side, adjusting the final images projected along the gallery walls. Unlike previous nights, there was no room for improvisation. Every detail had been choreographed to maximize impact and minimize risk. The campaign's narrative, long in preparation, was about to confront the predator directly. Julian approached at the precise moment Claire expected. Polished charm, thinly veiled threat. "I hear congratulations are in order," he said smoothly. "On what?" Claire asked, voice steady. "On survival," he replied. "Maison Valerius has become visible again." "And yet," she countered, "you still seek control." Julian's smile did not falter. "Every empire needs a guardian. Yours just arrived late." Claire gestured toward the projections. "Perhaps guardians should watch carefully what they protect. Some ghosts are more dangerous than the living." Julian's eyes flickered briefly to the images. Subtle, almost imperceptible. A flicker of recognition that he had miscalculated. When she stepped onto the stage to deliver her speech, the room hushed immediately. Cameras focused, glasses poised midair. Every board member, every investor, every whispering critic waited for Claire to choose submission or defiance. She began deliberately. "Maison Valerius has always embraced boldness. Provocation. Challenge. That is why we exist." The audience nodded, anticipating a general celebration. She held their attention, pacing just enough to command the room. Then, with calm precision, she revealed the images of Elias's early work, not censored, not excused, but contextualized. Each piece accompanied by a concise explanation of artistic intent, the era, the subject's consent, and, finally, the financial trail leading back to Julian Vine's offshore accounts. A murmur spread through the crowd. Julian's expression shifted imperceptibly from composure to calculation, then to realization. He had expected her to falter, to condemn Elias, to neutralize the narrative. Instead, she wielded it as a weapon, exposing not just the images but the man who had orchestrated their use for leverage. The moment she stepped back, silence fell. Not judgmental, shocked, calculated pause. Then applause, tentative at first, swelling into genuine recognition. Maison Valerius had survived not by retreat, but by transparency and strategic courage. Julian Vine didn't stay silent. As the murmur of the crowd grew, he stood up, his voice projecting with practiced, calm authority over the room. "A fascinating performance, Claire," he said, loud enough to stop the applause. "But context doesn't erase history. You're asking these people to celebrate exploitation as art." Claire didn't wait for the crowd to turn. She clicked the remote, and a final document appeared on the screen. Julian's own signature on the original wire transfer to the production company. "I'm not asking them to celebrate the past, Julian," she said, her voice cutting through his. "I'm asking them to look at the man who paid for it. The same man who just tried to buy my silence with the very evidence he created." The room went deathly cold. Julian's mouth tightened, his composure finally shattering as he realized the audience was no longer looking at the photos. They were looking at him. He didn't say another word. He simply turned and exited the hall through the service door, a shadow retreating from the light. Claire found Elias in the wings. No words were needed. The fracture between them, though still there, had finally begun to close. And for the first time, she could breathe. The weeks after the gala were quiet, almost eerily so. The press had digested Claire's revelation, parsing the implications of Julian Vine's involvement with calm fascination. Maison Valerius was no longer a whisper in the industry. It had reclaimed its reputation as bold, innovative, and unassailable. The board watched quietly, calculating, but no one challenged her authority. Even those who had doubted her now deferred, acknowledging that Claire's combination of courage and strategy had not only preserved the house, but elevated it. Elias returned fully to the studio, no longer a secret collaborator, but a recognized partner in the brand's new vision. The tension between them that had once threatened to rupture under moral and personal pressures now settled into trust. Their creative sessions were uninterrupted by fear of leverage or compromise. Every photograph, every campaign element, reflected a collaboration built on mutual respect, not obligation. Julian Vine retreated, but not in defeat alone. His plans had been exposed, his influence reduced. The scandal that had threatened to destroy the house now threatened his reputation, forcing him into temporary invisibility in elite financial circles. Claire had neutralized the predator without playing the victim. She had not compromised her values, and she had not surrendered the house her father built. One crisp morning, months after the storm, Claire walked the quiet halls of Maison Valerius, reflecting on the journey. Each step echoed with memory. Late nights reviewing documents, tense confrontations, whispered arguments with Elias, the calculated reveal at the gala. Triumph had been earned through intellect, courage, and unflinching honesty. Elias appeared in the doorway, holding 2 cups of coffee, a small smile on his face. "It's calm," he said, stepping forward. "It's not quiet," Claire replied. "It's ours." They walked together across the studio, past images that had once been weapons, now symbols of survival and vision. The past no longer had the power to dominate them. The present belonged to their choices. The future, to their partnership. At the rooftop terrace, overlooking the city, Claire finally allowed herself to exhale. The skyline was brilliant, indifferent to power plays or scandals, yet it reflected the triumph of persistence. Elias leaned closer. "So what now?" Claire turned, eyes meeting his. No pretense, no hierarchy. "Now," she said, "we build something new. Together." The sun rose over Paris, washing the streets in gold. Maison Valerius, reborn not just in image but in principle, stood as a testament to resilience, vision, and uncompromising integrity. And on that terrace, 2 people who had been tested by threats, ambition, and moral peril finally allowed themselves to exist not as player and pawn, not as employer and subordinate, but as equals, partners in life and in legacy. The empire survived. They survived, and the game was theirs to redefine.